What is up, Tube users? I am the Stereotypical Gamer, and welcome back to another episode of Overwatch 2 Heroes, an in-depth guide. Today, we are talking about one of the most unique tank heroes in the game, in my opinion, Zarya. Let's get right into things and go over her passive ability. Zarya's passive ability is Energy. This passive allows damage that is absorbed by her abilities to transfer into damage for her primary and secondary fire. We'll get into the specifics of her abilities and her primary and secondary fire in a bit, but basically, damage absorbed charges up her primary and secondary fire. Speaking of, let's talk about Zarya's primary fire. Zarya's primary fire is Particle Cannon. This is a beam weapon that deals 85 damage per second at a minimum charge, up to a maximum of 170 damage per second at maximum charge. This beam fires at 20 rounds per second and has a maximum range of 15 meters. Being that it is a beam weapon, it cannot deal headshot damage to enemies. Now, let's move on to talk about Zarya's alternate fire. Zarya's alternate fire for Particle Cannon is an arcing projectile that deals area of effect damage. This alternate fire deals 47 to 9.5 damage to enemies at a minimum charge, and 95 to 19 damage to enemies at maximum charge. The radius for the splash damage is pretty small at 2.5 meters. It's also worth noting that Zarya can deal self-damage with this alternate fire, but the damage is halved. Each projectile fired with this alternate fire consumes 25 ammo. Zarya can fire a projectile even with less than 25 ammo and still deal full damage. Now, let's move on to talking about how Zarya charges up this damage by talking about her first ability. Zarya's first ability is Particle Barrier. This is a bubble casted around Zarya that can absorb up to 200 HP for 2 seconds. While this bubble is up, Zarya gains 1% energy for every 5 damage blocked, so one bubble can give Zarya a maximum of 40% energy. This ability also cleanses Zarya from most negative status effects such as slows, hack, anti-heal, and damage over time effects. This ability will also prevent a lot of negative effects such as stuns, knockbacks, sleeps, hooks, and being frozen if the ability is used before those effects take place. This ability also has 2 charges, so Zarya could technically use a second bubble on herself once the first bubble has worn off. However, this ability shares charges with her second ability. Zarya's second ability is Projected Barrier. This is the same thing as Zarya's first ability, but the bubble can be projected onto allies within a 30-meter range. It has the same effects as the Particle Barrier and will gain energy from Zarya if the ally is taking damage. A couple things to note about this ability is it cannot be used on the same target for an additional 2 seconds after the bubble has expired or broken. Another key thing about this ability is even though it shares charges and a cooldown with Zarya's first ability, this ability has a slightly shorter cooldown of only 8 seconds compared to 10 seconds on Zarya's Projected Barrier. Now, let's dive into talking about Zarya's ultimate ability. Zarya's ultimate ability is Graviton Surge. This is a arcing projectile that deals some area of effect damage and pulls enemies into the center of mass of this projectile. The ability lasts for 3.5 seconds. Over that time, it will deal 5 damage on impact and 5 damage per second on targets. While this damage is very minuscule, the effect of the projectile is what makes it deadly. The range that enemies will get pulled is 6 meters. While within this effect of this ultimate, all enemy movement abilities are disabled. It's worth noting that when fired, this ability is a projectile, meaning it can be absorbed by things like defense matrix or deflected by deflect. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's move on to talking about heroes that counter and are countered by Zarya. Zarya is a brawler type tank who works best at playing up close and personal, trying to absorb as much damage as possible from the front line to charge up her projectile cannon. A tank hero, Zarya excels at playing against is D.Va. Because Zarya's primary fire is a beam, D.Va has no way to defend herself from this. Plus, Zarya can absorb a good amount of D.Va's burst damage from her micro missiles with just one bubble. As for a DPS hero Zarya plays well against, I'm going to go with Junkrat. Junkrat is all about spamming certain choke points to try and get picks. Because of this, Zarya can hold those choke points and gather energy pretty easily from his primary fire. Plus, if you get close to a Junkrat and kill him, you can use his passive martyrdom to gain more energy even after he's dead. Finally, a support hero Zarya plays well against is Ana. Ana's biggest utility by far is her biotic grenade, causing anti-heal on enemy targets within its range. Luckily, Zarya's bubbles can cleanse that effect while also absorbing incoming damage. Now, let's move on to talk about heroes that counter Zarya. Zarya is most effective absorbing and damaging enemies in close range, and with no movement abilities, she can be an easy target against ranged heroes. A tank hero that plays well against Zarya is Reinhardt. Reinhardt is also a close range tank, but has a longer uptime for protecting himself and allies compared to Zarya and her bubbles. Plus, damage up close is much more dangerous with Reinhardt compared to Zarya if she's not at full charge. As for a DPS hero that plays well against Zarya, I'm going to go with Widowmaker. Widowmaker is excellent at playing the long-range game and being patient and waiting out Zarya's bubbles. A Widowmaker with good positioning can almost be impossible for Zarya to deal with on her own, making this matchup a nightmare for Zarya. Finally, a support hero that plays well against Zarya is Lifeweaver. Lifeweaver is also pretty capable at playing the range game and escaping Zarya, while also protecting his teammates who might be too close to a full charge Zarya. Plus, his pedal platform can lift his allies out of Zarya's ultimate pretty easily if positioned properly. Now, let's dive into some tips and tricks for Zarya. While Zarya doesn't have that much movement in terms of abilities and such, you can use her alternate fire to gain a little bit of extra speed at the cost of some self-damage, and also allow you to get into some higher up places. If you use it right at your feet and jump as you're firing, you can get a little bit higher than you would normally jumping, so you can get to some cheeky spots if you're pretty good with her parkour skills. For the most part, when engaging in team fights, you want to always try and have at least one bubble up and ready, just in case like high burst damage comes out to you or an ally. That way you're just not stuck with 0 bubbles and not being able to do anything, because Zarya with 0 bubbles, even at full charge, is very vulnerable. I would say for the most part, it's easier to gain energy by projecting the barrier, using the projected barrier to cast it on yourself rather than an ally, because most of the time allies aren't going to recognize that they have this bubble and they're just going to sit back for the most part, although good players will understand and know what to do if they get a projected barrier. But for the most part, I would say if you're trying to gain energy, it's going to be best to do it on yourself, because you are the tank, you are the biggest target. It's just easier for enemies to shoot your barrier compared to other enemies, or other allies rather. As for Zarya's ultimate, I find the best way to get effective use from the ultimate is to either combo it with another ally's ultimate, or to use it when you have high charge. Since the enemies rather will be gathered up during the ultimate, it can be super useful at high charge, just using your secondary fire and just raining down damage onto enemies. Although it's also super good for pairing with allied ultimates that are AoE effects. So things like Hanzo's Dragon is a really good one to pair with. Tracer's Pulse Bomb is another one. Even Ilari's Captive Sun is a really good ultimate to pair your ultimate with. But anyways, that's all the tips and tricks I have for you today for Zarya. Make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Comment any other tips and tricks you have for Zarya. It would definitely help me out since I'm still pretty much a noob at playing Zarya. And make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.
That rhythm.